All right, and good afternoon and welcome to this meeting hosted by the New Mexico Environment Department to provide an overview of the Per and Poly-Fluoroalkyl Substances, or PFAS Protection Act, and associated rulemaking. We appreciate everyone's attendance to learn more about these requirements and their broad applicability to products sold, offered for sale, distributed, or distributed for sale in New Mexico. Today, you will hear from NMED staff, including Greg Smith-Kier, who is our Assistant General Counsel of the New Mexico Environment Department, Eric Chapman, Science Coordinator in the Office of Strategic Initiatives, and myself, the Acting Director of the Office of Strategic Initiatives at NMED, Christina Keys. We also have a number of additional staff here in the room, including Drew Goretzka, Director of Communications, and Robbie Pickering from Eastern Research Group Incorporated, or ERG, who is supporting NMED in this effort. After the presentation, we will have a period in which some of the questions received will be answered, and we will address as time allows during our questions and answers portion of the agenda. Please note that any formal feedback on the proposed rule should be provided via the New Mexico Environment Department's official public comment process, which we will address near the end of the presentation. Questions and comments provided via the chat today will not be considered as part of the formal public comment process. And now I'll turn it over to Kessel John of ERG for some housekeeping instructions.
Thank you, and welcome everyone who's joining us today. Before we get started, I have some Zoom housekeeping interpretation instructions. So this meeting is available with interpretation into ASL, or American Sign Language, and Spanish. Both Spanish and ASL interpretation are available by clicking on the interpretation icon in your Zoom control panel, indicated by a globe. Automated closed captions are also available by clicking on the CC icon. If you don't see the interpretation or closed caption icons, you can click on the More button, indicated by 3 dots, that's usually to the right of your Zoom control panel, and a menu will pop up that should have those options there. If you experience any audio issues, you can call into the meeting by clicking on the upward arrow next to your audio icon, selecting Switch to Phone Audio, and following the instructions provided. You can also call in using the number 833-568-8864 and inputting the webinar ID 161-008-3668. And this information is also on the Zoom join links that you received in your email. If you have any Zoom technical issues, you can put them into the Q&A box or email me at meetings@erg.com and I'll troubleshoot with you. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Christina.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. We're glad you're participating in this webinar today on the implementation of New Mexico's PFAS Protection Act. The mission of NMED is to protect and restore the environment and to foster a healthy and prosperous New Mexico for present and future generations. This is implemented through science, innovation, collaboration, and compliance. The genesis of the PFAS Protection Act is to protect New Mexico's resources, which are also universal resources for all, both within the state and across our country. Clean water, clean air, a clean environment, which in turn supports all human health. New Mexico is a state in the western United States that may be defined by its arid landscape. It's a stark reality that almost the entire population of New Mexico, 1.7 million people, rely on groundwater for its drinking water. This dependence means that the health of our underground aquifers is directly linked to the health and sustainability of every community, from urban centers to the smallest rural settlements. In a state where water quantity is already a struggle due to climate change, the issue of water quality becomes even more paramount to sustain our communities. Losing access to clean, reliable groundwater isn't just an inconvenience, it's an existential threat. The irony that fueled the push of the PFAS Protection Act was glaring. There are no chemical manufacturers of PFAS in New Mexico. Despite this, evidence was mounting that the PFAS was present. Reports and testing began showing the impacts of PFAS moving through our economy and into our environment, often near and far from industrial sites. This indicated a diffuse, non-point source of contamination that was pervasive across the state. The likely sources are the very things New Mexicans use in their daily lives. Consumer products brought into people's homes are getting into wastewater systems, septic systems, and municipal landfill leachate. One consumer product fabric protector sold in New Mexico today had a PFOA concentration 50 times higher than US EPA's drinking water standard, and the label says non-toxic and non-hazardous. With 30% of New Mexicans, or over 600,000 people, utilizing septic systems, and 20% of New Mexicans, or over 400,000 people, get their water from private wells. This problem is growing. This combination of near total reliance on groundwater, the insidious spread of a persistent chemical from common consumer goods, and the vulnerability of private well users created the political and social imperative for action. The goal of the proposed New Mexico PFAS Protection Act became clear: to regulate the introduction and eventual disposal of these forever chemicals within the state's economy to safeguard the foundational resource that sustains New Mexico's people and future. Through the generous and collaborative support of the House and the Senate of the state of New Mexico's legislature, House Bill 212 was passed during the 2025 legislative session and signed by Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, establishing the PFAS Protection Act in the state of New Mexico to help the state tackle PFAS exposure for generations to come. We are advancing the implementation of the PFAS Protection Act as our timeline is set in state law, and we will meet those deadlines without delay, and we ask that you work with us to collaboratively address the prevention of groundwater contamination, protect agricultural industry, and local government investments. We will continue to advance our work on cleanups as well as preventing future contamination. And we are exceptionally proud of the leadership of the state of New Mexico with respect to PFAS issues and appreciate your engagement with us today. Today's presentation outlines the PFAS Protection Act. And on our next slide, this will provide us with the agenda for today's webinar. The webinar will cover the background on PFAS, an overview of the PFAS Protection Act, provide an overview of the proposed rule implementing the Act, next steps to take, as well as questions and answers. The objectives of the public meeting webinar include providing an overview of New Mexico's PFAS Protection Act, as well as PFAS impacts on human health and the environment. Another objective includes introducing the requirements for PFAS containing products under development by NMED, including a consumer label. We'll summarize the next steps in the regulatory timeline and outline opportunities to submit formal feedback to NMED and answer clarifying questions from meeting participants. And now I'm going to turn things over to Eric Chapman, our science coordinator in the Office of Strategic Initiatives, who will walk through the background on PFAS, New Mexico's activities related to PFAS, and the Protection Act and associated rule development.
Thank you, Christina. I'm going to provide some background on PFAS. PFAS stands for Per and Poly-Fluoroalkyl Substances. PFAS are a class of fluorinated organic chemicals containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. This class of chemicals includes thousands of synthesized compounds and are used in a variety of industrial processes and consumer products because of their useful qualities such as oil and water resistance. Because of their chemical stability, they break down very slowly over time and therefore are called forever chemicals. Unfortunately, even degradation products can persist in the environment. PFAS are not new. PFAS were developed in the late 1930s and 1940s around the time of World War II as part of the rapid advances in synthetic chemistry. During World War II, their unique properties, resistance to heat, chemicals, and friction made them valuable for seals, gaskets, and coatings in the Manhattan Project and other military applications. PFAS have been used in industrial applications and consumer products since the 1950s. Since the early 2000s, with a growing body of scientific research and improvements in environmental detection, awareness of the negative environmental and human health consequences of PFAS have grown. Some manufacturers have been phasing out, reducing, or replacing PFAS in products. However, their use is still prevalent today. In fact, PFAS are ubiquitous. They are just in about every product category you can think of. The graphic on the right represents some of the products where use remains prevalent. These products range from consumer and cleaning products to food packaging, to cosmetics, to apparel and construction products. There are common industrial uses as well. Firefighting foam, commonly cited as a primary cause of much of the water contamination throughout the US and New Mexico. However, PFAS is also used in the oil and gas industry as a fume suppressant in metal plating, amongst other uses. Although surfactant properties make PFAS useful in product applications such as nonstick cooking and waterproofing, research over the last few decades has demonstrated a number of negative human and environmental health consequences of PFAS exposure. Exposure to PFAS is associated with a number of health risks, including an increase in certain cancers, such as kidney and testicular cancers, liver disease, thyroid disease, elevated cholesterol, pregnancy complications, low birth weights, and impacts on the immune system that reduce the effectiveness of vaccines. Beyond the negative human health effects of PFAS, PFAS can negatively impact the environment as well. They enter the environment from many different sources, such as manufacturing and industrial plants, landfills, and wastewater treatment plants, and come back into contact with people and wildlife through many pathways, such as our food and water. By phasing out and ultimately banning products containing intentionally added PFAS, NMED is working to reduce the amount of new PFAS released into the environment. NMED is also working to reduce PFAS contamination already in the environment through a few projects that I will highlight next. This slide highlights how NMED is addressing PFAS in a number of ways. For instance, earlier this year, the Hazardous Waste Act was amended to explicitly classify discarded firefighting foams containing PFAS, commonly known as aqueous film forming foams, or AFFF, as hazardous waste. This classification provides us with the authority to require PFAS mitigation efforts. NMED is also recently conducting a study on 3 landfills in the state to analyze leachate and groundwater for PFAS levels. High levels of PFAS were detected in all leachate samples, but not in groundwater monitoring wells, showcasing the importance of properly designed and lined landfills to minimize groundwater contamination. NMED and the New Mexico Department of Justice have also filed suit against the U.S. Air Force to address PFAS contamination at Cannon Air Force Base from AFFF. NMED and NMDOH conducted a survey of Clovis residents and found 99.7% of residents have PFAS in their blood. NMED and the New Mexico Department of Justice have also filed suit against the Department of Defense to mitigate PFAS contamination at Holloman Air Force Base, after studies have documented extraordinarily high levels of PFAS in the Holloman Lake ecosystem. We also recently published a survey to better understand how the public recreates at Holloman Lake, and this will guide future efforts to minimize the public's exposure to PFAS in the environment. Finally, NMED established an emerging contaminants in small and disadvantaged communities program that offers free testing of PFAS and other emerging contaminants in drinking water and source water in small or disadvantaged communities, and educational materials and communication tools to help inform and engage the communities that they serve. Now I'm going to hand it over to Greg Smith here to review the PFAS Protection Act and the proposed rule.
Thanks, Eric. I'm now going to provide a brief overview of the PFAS Protection Act. House Bill 212, which is now known as the PFAS Protection Act, was signed into law by Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham on April 8, 2025. The intent of the act is to protect New Mexicans from PFAS exposure by limited and commonly used consumer products. The implementation of the PFAS Protection Act will lead to the direct and indirect monetary savings for New Mexicans, improved public health, and enhanced protection of our water and the environment. The PFAS Protection Act gives NMED the authority to take actions related to products with intentionally added PFAS with the intent of protecting consumers. The PFAS Protection Act includes a number of provisions. It phases out and subsequently prohibits certain products that contain intentionally added PFAS as a specified dates. Additional products can be identified for phase out or prohibition upon a finding that prohibition is needed to protect human health or the environment. The PFAS Protection Act also requires reporting of information for products containing intentionally added PFAS. Reporting is required by January 1st, 2027. If reporting does not occur for a product, that product is prohibited from being sold within New Mexico after January 1, 2028. The Act identifies product categories exempt from reporting requirements. The Act provides authority for the department to require product testing if there is reasonable suspicion that a product contains intentionally added PFAS, but either has not reported on the product or labeled the product. And lastly, the Act authorizes the Environmental Improvement Board to adopt rules requiring the label of products in both English and Spanish. The PFAS Protection Act authorizes the Environmental Improvement Board, or the EIB, to adopt rules implementing the provisions of the Act highlighted on the previous slide. And I'm now going to give you an overview of the implementation timeline of the proposed rule. This timeline shows the overall anticipated regulatory implementation schedule for the PFAS Protection Act proposed rule. NMED provided a stakeholder webinar focused on product labeling requirements on September 25th. A recording of that webinar is available on the NMED website. On Friday, NMED will present its petition to the Environmental Improvement Board to adopt the proposed rule and request a public hearing. The Environmental Improvement Board is an independent board consisting of 7 members that are appointed by the governor. The EIB is responsible for conducting public hearings to consider and potentially adopt many of the rules administered by NMED. Stakeholders will have the opportunity to provide feedback on the proposed rules throughout the process. The EIB will determine whether a hearing will be held and any changes that must be made to the rule. If a public hearing is set, stakeholders will be informed at least 60 days in advance before the hearing so they can submit comments. The phase out and prohibition dates shown in the timeline and will be discussed in more detail later in this presentation. This slide shows an outline for the proposed rule. It's important to note that the rule implementing the PFAS Protection Act will apply to manufacturers. The proposed rule covers several requirements for manufacturers and retailers who sell or distribute products containing intentionally added PFAS. We will review most of these topics in the subsequent slides. We will skip over the scope and objective sections since these are standard sections of any rule. The scope section generally describes who the rule applies to, and the objective section describes the overall goal of the rule. Definitions are another standard section contained in every rule. The definitions section includes definitions for terms that are used in the rule that are not already identified in the PFAS Protection Act. Now we're going to move on to product phase-outs and prohibitions. The rule has 3 phase-out dates for products containing intentionally added PFAS, which mirror those contained in the PFAS Protection Act. As of January 1, 2027, cookware, food packaging, dental floss, juvenile products, and firefighting foam that contain intentionally added PFAS may no longer be sold in New Mexico. Beginning January 1st, 2028, the prohibition extends to carpets, rugs, cleaning products, cosmetics, fabric treatments, feminine hygiene products, textiles, textile furnishing, ski wax, and upholstered furniture that contain intentionally added PFAS. Starting January 1, 2032, the prohibition extends to all products not otherwise exempt and not designated as a currently unavoidable use. The EIB also has the authority to prohibit additional products by adopting new rules if they determine it is necessary to protect human health and the environment. I'm now going to discuss products that are exempt from the prohibition, as well as the currently unavoidable use designation process. The PFAS Protection Act allows exemptions where PFAS is currently essential in the product. These exemptions apply to product prohibitions and reporting requirements. Manufacturers of these product types are also eligible to request an exemption from labeling requirements. This slide displays some of the product categories exempt from the sales prohibition and reporting. Next slide, please. Okay. Under the proposed rule, manufacturers that can demonstrate that use of PFAS in a product is essential for health, safety, or the function of society can apply for a currently unavoidable use designation that will permit them to continue selling otherwise prohibited products containing intentionally added PFAS in New Mexico. In order to receive a CUU designation, manufacturers must submit a CUU proposal to NMED for consideration. The proposal must include information on the product, including but not limited to identification and description of the product, an explanation of why the inclusion of PFAS in the product is essential for health, safety, or the function of society, identification of whether there are any alternatives that are readily available, and information known to the manufacturer regarding the impacts to human health or the environment of PFAS in the product. A list of approved CUUs will be made available to the public and posted on the NMED website. Okay, now moving on to the reporting section of the rule. The proposed rule also requires manufacturers to begin reporting detailed information about intentionally added PFAS contained in their products by January 1, 2027. Reporting is required once per product unless there has been a significant change to the information initially reported. NMED is in the process of developing an online reporting system that manufacturers will use to submit their products. The type of information manufacturers will be required to report includes, but is not limited to, a description of the product, as well as the purpose, type, and amount of PFAS in the product. If manufacturers do not report on products containing intentionally added PFAS, those products are prohibited from sale in New Mexico after January 1, 2028. I'm now going to hand the presentation over to Robbie Pickering from ERG to discuss product labeling.
Thanks, Greg. So NMED believes that product labeling is critical for ensuring that New Mexican consumers understand what's in the items that they are purchasing and interacting with. NMED intends for labeling requirements in the proposed rule to apply to all products sold, offered for sale, distributed, or distributed for sale in New Mexico that contain intentionally added PFAS. Product labeling requirements apply to the product itself and potentially its consumer packaging. Consumer packaging must be labeled if packaging obscures the label on the product and needs to include a website URL or QR code that directs to an NMED website with information on PFAS use in products. If consumers are unable to view the label or consumer packaging when purchasing the product, such as in online or catalog sales, then the manufacturer or retailer shall communicate that the product contains intentionally added PFAS to the prospective consumer prior to purchase via sales literature, web pages, product specification sheets, or marketing materials. NMED has established separate labeling and disclosure requirements for complex durable goods. Complex durable goods could be products like appliances, motor vehicles, electronics, and large machinery that rely on hundreds of components such as and have complex supply chains and are intended to be used for more than 5 years. In acknowledgement that these types of products are manufactured and purchased differently, NMED established similar but separate labeling requirements for complex durable goods. Complex durable goods should include a similar label and disclosure on specification sheets rather than the product itself, but are also required to include a list of components containing intentionally added PFAS in the owner's operation and maintenance manual. Used products, which are defined as products that have been previously installed, operated, or utilized for their intended purposes, are exempt from labeling. Manufacturers of products falling into categories exempt from reporting requirements of the PFAS Protection Act may also apply for labeling exemption that may be granted if they demonstrate that consumers will not come in direct contact with intentionally added PFAS while the product is being used as intended and throughout the product's useful life. I want to note that if you're a manufacturer that are interested in more details on the labeling requirements within the proposed rule, we had a stakeholder webinar given on September 25th. It's available on the NMED PFAS website, which is actually the one linked to in the second bullet on this slide. So if you're interested in listening to that webinar, you can click on that link. NMED has developed the proposed symbology shown here to communicate to consumers the presence of intentionally added PFAS. The images on the left show an example of an Erlenmeyer flask with an exclamation point and a bold PFAS in the center. This symbol is shown in a few different color and shade variations. The symbol is intended for use on products that require permanent marking on the surface of the product, such as cookware. The graphics on the right include a caution statement adjacent to the label marking. The caution statement states that PFAS is associated with environmental impacts and health effects, including cancer, and is included in both English and Spanish. This example is shown with the URL to the NMED website. However, NMED intends to also permit manufacturers to use a QR code. These graphics at the right are representative of the label intended on product packaging and online or catalog marketing materials where product packaging is unable to be viewed at the point of sale. Please note that these graphics are shown for illustration purposes only and are still going through some internal refinement. However, they represent the intended look, feel, and wording of the label. Shown here are a few examples of the label used on products and product packaging. On the left is an example of a pan with the flask PFAS symbol engraved on the bottom. In the middle and on the right are examples of the label and cautionary statement in English and Spanish on packaging for a cosmetic and a cleaning product. The labels are small in each of these images, but you can see how the label is intended to be used on the products. And this slide shows an example of what labeling may look like on a product specification sheet or in the owner's manual for a complex durable good. In addition to the label statement, the owner's manual is required to communicate the list of components with intentionally added PFAS and their location within the product. I'm now going to hand things back over to Greg to discuss testing, fees, and enforcement section of the rule.
Thanks, Robbie. I'm now going to discuss the provisions of the proposed rule relating to PFAS testing, fees, and enforcement. If NMED has reason to believe that products being distributed or sold in New Mexico contain intentionally added PFAS, the department can test or require the manufacturer to test their product to determine the presence and concentration of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances in the product. This does not apply to a medical device or drug or the packaging of a medical device or drugs that are regulated by the US FDA. If testing reveals the presence of intentionally added PFAS, the manufacturer could be assessed an enforcement penalty or may otherwise be prohibited from continuing to sell that product in New Mexico. These must be paid to the department when fulfilling the reporting requirements under the proposed rule and when applying for a CUU designation. Violations of the PFAS Protection Act will be enforced through compliance orders issued by the department or through civil actions filed in New Mexico District Court. The civil penalties associated with violations are outlined in the PFAS Protection Act and are also contained in the proposed rule. I'm now going to pass it back to Christina to discuss opportunities for public input and other next steps.
All right, thank you, Greg. As you can see here, there are several opportunities for stakeholders and the public to provide input. This timeline, as stated here, on September 25th, our public comment portal opened up for the rulemaking effort through the start of the hearing. And New Mexico hosts the stakeholder webinar to provide an overview of labeling requirements. A recording of that webinar may be found on the NMED website. On October 8th, the proposed rule is brought to the EIB. On October 22nd, we're holding the virtual public meeting on the proposed rule. On October 24th, Friday, at the EIB's October meeting, we will hear the EIB provide a determination whether a hearing will be granted. And then 60 days prior to the hearing, the public notice of the hearing and the public comment period will begin. We anticipate, if granted by the EIB, a hearing sometime in late February, early March, otherwise spring of 2026, the exact timing to be determined. We will also be dropping the link to the public comment portal into the chat, and we'll provide it on the last slide of today's presentation. Beginning in spring 2026, NMED will launch a public education campaign to empower consumers and other purchasers to buy fewer PFAS-containing products. The goal will be to inform consumers about the presence of PFAS in everyday products and ensure that they understand the meaning of the product label they'll start seeing in 2027. This campaign is currently under development, and as we determine how to best reach New Mexicans with this information, so stay tuned. And with that, thank you everyone for your time and attendance. On this slide is an email address that stakeholders can use to reach out for more information or to request a meeting. We also have links to the public comment portal to provide the PFAS Protection Act rulemaking, the PFAS Protection Act that was approved by the New Mexico legislature and signed by the governor, and the proposed rule that is now before the Environmental Improvement Board for consideration. Lastly, thank you for the members of the public and community organizations. We have also included a link to the PFAS Holloman Lake Recreation Use Survey. This survey will be available until November 30th. If you have recreated at Holloman Lake in the past, we would be interested in hearing from you. So please take the time to fill out the survey found at the bottom of this slide as appropriate. And at this time, we will begin to address questions that have come in from webinar participants.
So the first question is, how exactly do I tell if products contain PFAS? What is the best way to avoid as of now?
Thanks, Drew. So there's currently no established mechanism for consumers to easily determine whether a product contains intentionally added PFAS. One of the primary goals of the PFAS Protection Act and associated proposed rule is to require manufacturers to report and disclose information about intentionally added PFAS within their products. Further, the labeling requirements will make clear to consumers that PFAS are present.
Thanks, Greg. Is the label requirements also codified in law? If so, what are the requirements, or where can I find more specifics?
Sure. So the statutory authority for that comes from the Environmental Improvement Act and the PFAS Protection Act. And specifically, HB 212 Section 4B provides the authority for the board to adopt rules to label in both English and Spanish.
And how will New Mexico approach PFAS labels required by other states?
The manufacturer of a product with intentionally added PFAS may comply with the labeling requirements of this rule by labeling all units of the product sold in New Mexico in compliance with corresponding requirements adopted by another state. If approved, the labeling plan includes state-specific elements such as telephone numbers, statutory references, websites, or public outreach measures. A description of the adjustments must be shown that will implement the New Mexico-specific plan.
Gotcha. Why would products exempt from all other sections of HB 212 be required to label?
Sure. So the goal of that is to provide transparency to consumers and other purchasers about the presence of PFAS in these products. The information label will be required for all products that contain PFAS, even if they are exempt from other parts of the rule.
And what is the process to request an exemption for PFAS labeling?
If you want to request an exemption from PFAS labeling, you must submit a waiver request to NMED containing the information that's at 20.13.2.13.f of the proposed rule.
Will there be a portal or similar mechanism for the January 1st, 2027 reporting deadline?
There will be. NMED is working on an online reporting portal for manufacturers to report information on products with intentionally added PFAS. And we intend to have that reporting system available by mid-2026.
Is this an annual reporting of chemicals or a product registry?
So the proposed rule outlines reporting. There's an initial reporting requirement, but subsequent reporting is only required if a significant change happens with respect to the PFAS concentration in the product beyond what was originally reported.
Gotcha. And how and when can product types be submitted for currently unavoidable use?
So this is addressed in the proposed rule at 20.13.2.11.a. And the initial round of products that are going to be banned beginning January 1, 2027. The deadline for those CEU applications will be October 31st of 2026.
And will there be a labeling sell-through period for PFAS containing products manufactured before January 1st, 2027?
So the PFAS Protection Act prohibition applies to the product sales date as opposed to the manufacturing date. So products with intentionally added PFAS that are within that first category that's prohibited on January 1, 2027, they will not be permitted to be sold after that date.
And how is NMED testing for PFAS and monitoring compliance with this regulation?
Two ways. So the department may test or may require manufacturers to test their product to determine the presence and concentration of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances in the product. Testing must be measured using a commercially available analytical method and must demonstrate that fluorine from impurities or contaminants is present below 100 parts per million.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
All right, with that concludes our presentation for today, covering the New Mexico PFAS Protection Act. If you have any questions or would like to review the source documents for the PFAS Protection Act, the draft rule, and other items related to the Act, please go to env.nm.gov. Again, thank you very much from the New Mexico Environment Department staff and ERG and the state of New Mexico.